Professor Perry's talk indicates, pushing the limits of the possible necessarily means that we need to think about things very differently. And so maybe just because something works doesn't mean that we can't question it. And so our next speaker is an agent of Telecomics, which is the activist organization that served as tech support in the Arab Spring. Though, as indicated by his website and his Twitter handle, he might be better known for wearing pants. So please welcome Peter Fein.
I'm going to tell you a story about the future and the past and the internet. I'm here today to tell you that democracy is obsolete. When we say something is obsolete, we don't mean that it's worn out, but rather that it's out of date. That we found better ways to do something that are cheaper, faster, or scale to larger numbers of people. An axe wears out chopping down cherry trees. Your first generation iPod still works, but it's obsolete. Things that are obsolete don't magically disappear, and the leftovers are called legacies. Legacies can hang around for quite a long time because they're large and pervasive, and the cost of upgrading all at once is too high. As we push them further and further beyond their limits, legacies accumulate cruft, grow more and more massive. Audio cassette tapes are obsolete. Signing your name when you pay by credit card is legacy. And if you think this has nothing to do with politics, remember we still name our months after Roman emperors who have been dead for 2,000 years. I'm going to tell a very abbreviated story about democracy and obsolescence. When we talk about democracy, we seem to mean a form of government where citizens vote for a representative who goes off to the seat of power and represents your interests and makes decisions on your behalf. This is the model of the US Constitution, which has been exported around the world and been scaled up and down from your local school board to the United Nations. In 1789, we needed representatives because it took 3 days to get a letter from Boston to Washington, D.C., if it arrived at all. Democracy is government for the horseback age. But this mostly works for about 100 years, so let's skip forward to the invention of radio, which should have finally obsoleted handwritten letters. But radio never really gets a chance to fully develop because in the late 1920s, it's taken over by the government and commercial interests and becomes this one-way broadcast mass medium. While Germany gets the Nazis, in the US, we still have this legacy of a horseback democracy. Representation doesn't really scale, though, so we have to keep implementing larger and larger bureaucracies. A free press no longer means a literal printing press, but rather a commercially controlled, government-blessed institution. Go forward 3 generations, and the state and the market and the law have completely eaten everything else. There's no space left, to the point where we have non-profits and non-governmental organizations without an identity of their own. But a funny thing happens on the way to the end of history. In 1996, we get the internet on speed dial. And within just a few years, broadcast mass media is obsolete. This leaves us some large, crufty legacies like CNN's millions of Twitter followers and the New York Times. The net allows richer, faster, cheaper communications directly from person to person. So we hope that it will allow us to build a real democracy, as Doug Rushkoff called it, or fret that it won't, as he did, as if we could somehow return to a mythic past that's already several generations out of date. Then in 2011, the world just seems to go nuts. The revolution will be tweeted, there's WikiLeaks and Anonymous and Tahrir and the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street and Anonymous again, and the SOPA protests, and massive street rallies against ACTA all over Europe. Yet we keep viewing these events through obsolete mass media lens. We know you can't just add Twitter and water and watch your democracy grow. But we don't have a new way to explain what's happening. I've had the privilege of participating in quite a few of these movements over the past 2 years. I think we need some new words. Adhocracy exists in the spaces left over and in between. It's a politics of practice and oral tradition. While I can stand up here and try to explain adhocracy to you like a high school teacher, it's kind of like sex. You can't really understand it until you do it. But here are some stories from under the covers. Telecomics is an ad hoc activist cluster of a few hundred humans and machines, programmers, network admins, students, punks, politicians, pirates, parents, and others. Journalist John Pollock said the Libyan resistance was a network of cousins. You need a ride or some guns, you get it from your cousin or your cousin's cousin. In that sense, telecomics is a network of friends and data lovers. We have no formal members, we have no leaders, we have no permanent subgroups. We're all volunteers, we take no money at all. We have no mailing address, there's nowhere you can send a package. We certainly have no official spokespeople. If telecomics exists anywhere, it's in our chat networks and the networks of relationships of the people who participate. We operate on a simple principle. Show up, find collaborators, and just go do. And I'll be honest, mostly what we do is hang out and chat and do nothing. People have other interests than occupations. Remember, it's ad hoc. But some days, we help keep the internet running in the Middle East. The press has called us tech support for the Arab Spring. We've deployed advanced encryption and built drones, rebuilt dial-up modem pools, and spammed fax machines with treatments for tear gas. When the Mubarak government blocked Twitter, Egyptians found our chat network and gave us news reports that we tweeted using our account. That's the kind of facilitation of communication that we do. Like the rest of the internet, telecomics is put together with bubblegum and popsicle sticks. Some days the server crashes or gets DDoSed or somebody forgets to pay the domain bill, and nothing ever seems to get written down. This turns out to be a good thing because when the internet breaks, we can just go get some more popsicle sticks and go fix it. When the net went down in Egypt, telecomics didn't call Ron Wyden, to call Hillary Clinton, to call Obama, to call Mubarak, to say, please turn it back on. Instead, we took direct action. We got out some modems and faxes and just did it ourselves. Though telecomics is just a bunch of telecommunist cipher hippies, we don't have a bank account mainly because we just couldn't be bothered to set one up. The paperwork and the forms and incorporations, and what country is this all actually located in, sir? It's a huge amount of bureaucratic overhead. If you're focused on getting things done, it's actually more cost-effective not to use money at all. No, really, this works better. The State Department invited me to a workshop on internet freedom, and after 5 days of back-and-forth emails, I finally just gave up and booked my own plane ticket. When telecomics started our Syria operation last July, we had network scans and contacts on the ground inside 3 days. Those scans uncovered evidence of a U.S. company called Blue Coat's hardware being used to censor the net in Syria. Within 6 months, we built front-page stories on Slashdot and the Wall Street Journal, and politicked in the European Union, which for the first time ever passed export controls on censorship hardware. A dozen people can set in motion a loose chain of events, ending in a change of international law in less time than it takes the government to buy a plane ticket. While this may all seem very new and networked and cool, adhocracy is actually quite old. I met an anthropologist who spent the past 20 years studying rural villages in Latin America. She told me they'll have a meeting and 300 people will get together and they'll sit around and they'll talk and argue for an hour or two and nothing really seems to get decided. And then 2 days later, a bridge has been built. We already know how to do this. Adhocracy is common as negotiating where to go for dinner or seat swaps on an airplane. Ad hoc movements are popping up because our formal political institutions have failed. The UN's ongoing inability to act on Syria being an egregious example. We think regressive laws like SOPA and ACTA are a threat to the internet, and they are, but the radical disconnect between the policies they propose and our day-to-day lives is in fact a greater threat to the rule of law itself. Politics is no longer left versus right. It's internet versus television. When you have an obsolete legacy system on the edge of collapse, it's tempting to throw it out and start fresh. But experience in technology teaches us to avoid this if we can. Revolution is expensive and risky. It doesn't work well when you have a large dependent user base, and you often know less than you thought you did. Instead, you need to replace it from the bottom up. We need to starve the beast, not of dollars, but of our personal investment and energy. It took a long, long time to get ourselves into this mess, and we are going to spend the rest of our lives rebuilding a better world. The question we need to ask is not what we can do for our country or what our country can do for us, but what we can rebuild for ourselves, for each other, and for our internet. Thank you.